I don't know how brief, but a brief history of multiform spaces. So.
Hi, can everyone hear me? Great. Okay, so as Shane and Jennifer said, they asked me to give a brief history of the multipurpose forum, which I'm going to try my best to do. There's a lot of information out there and we're not going to hit it all. It's just going to try and skirt along the top here. While we might think of the multipurpose forum as being a newer archetype, or even as being a North American origin, gathering spaces have always been used for the purposes other than their primary function. In some cases, the spaces were designed with means of adapting to support other uses. But as often is the case with a gathering space, once it was constructed, someone walked in and said, you know what I could use this for? When we go all the way back to the Colosseum, we can find examples of a space that was being used for many, many purposes. Most of us are familiar with it being used for hosting gladiatorial contests and executions and animal hunts, but the space was also used for the reenactment of famous battles, including mock sea battles, which you can see there in that image, and it was used for dramas. They did classical mythology there, and they set up elaborate stage sets. The first proscenium theater was the Teatro Firenze in Parma, and that was built in 1608. This house was used for drama and opera and ballet, but it also had a flat floor in the center that was called the arena, and they used that for court ceremonies and for balls and also for equestrian acts. And the theater could also be flooded to do mock naval battles. The first opera house was the Teatro San Cassiano, and that was built in Venice in 1637. So in addition to this one being the first opera house that we know of or can date, this was also the first public theater that was available. And it took the theater out of the hands of the nobility and put it into the public domain. And so the theater was the first one that had public buying tickets, which also meant it was the first time that they started to think about how large a theater was and how many people it could seat, as opposed to just pure entertainment for the nobility of the house. The Rådhushallen was built in 1705, and it was called an opera house, but it also hosted concerts, masquerade balls, and wedding banquets. One of the important things to note about this was that it was the place where Strauss and Liszt were conducting. It was the place that many of Mozart's small operas and his dance music were originally performed, and Beethoven's 8th Symphony and Schubert's 8th Symphony were also premiered here. The Magdreville Opera House in Bayreuth was built in 1748. It also had a flat floor at the orchestra level so that it could be used for balls and other court entertainment. And then we found the first room that was designed specifically for music, and this was the Holywell Music Room in Oxford. And this one is the first one that's noted as being designed, purpose-built for music. It was the place where Haydn was popularized. But eventually this room was also used for gatherings and meeting spaces, and eventually was turned back over to just be a proper music room. Around that same time, there are lots of references for places being built as temporary theater spaces. In Versailles, in the stables, they were often constructing temporary theaters, as shown here in this seating detail for a temporary theater construction at the Riding Academy. But Louis XV had 3 grandsons that were about to get married and decided that he was tired of constructing these temporary venues all the time because they were quite expensive, and so instead decided he would make an entire opera house that would be used to host the weddings. It was also used, though, for ballroom and banquets and hosted his National Assembly. So we moved to the Concertgebouw in Amsterdam. Now this building was constructed in 1888. We've moved a little further in time here. But the important thing to note about it is even though it's considered one of the best concert halls there is, specifically purpose-built. It was also being used for multiple uses, like hosting this guy, who is most definitely not Beethoven. The Concertgebouw gets used for orchestral performances, but also for opera, and then does a lot of popular music acts, world music and jazz. Led Zeppelin played there, as did Pink Floyd and The Who. So what are the origins of the building form? We now know that everything has always been used for multiple purposes. It has and always will be, but where did the form come from? The original form was first factor that was dictating its shape was, of course, not surprisingly, structure. The structure of the time was timber, and timbers have a strength, a capacity that is a maximum of like 90 feet or about 27 meters before the self-weight starts to collapse on itself. And so that was a maximum distance that you could use in theaters of antiquity. When we look at the Odeon of Agrippa in Athens, you can see that this room was about, 82 feet, I believe, 25 meters, and it had 1,000 seats in it, but eventually it did collapse on its own self-weight, and they rebuilt the structure as a 500-seat lecture hall. So if you want to have more people in a gathering space, what do? You take that minimum dimension and keep it in the width, and you hold it while making it longer. It could, in theory, keep going on forever and ever, but there is another factor that will then limit the length that you can use, and that is our visual ability to see and discern faces, and that limit is at about 70 feet. So with the width of the theater controlled by the structural capacity, and the length and distances controlled by what humans can see, what were the factors that controlled the heights in these rooms? So the structure had the limits on the height because of its strength and its capacity and stability, but really ventilation and lighting were the next factors that played a large role in shaping the theater form. Looking at the Odeon of Agrippa, the ventilation was provided by having windows down low and then windows at the top, which allowed air to move in and then go out the upper windows. This is called the stack effect. So this principle, you have hot air rising because it's a lower pressure. Cool air is sucked in through the openings, and then the heat is generated by the people, and it rises and then flows out the outer windows at the top, and which then draws in more air from the bottom. So the area of the openings at the bottom has to be equal to the area of the openings at the top. And if we go back to the Odeon, you can see the walls are lined with doors and windows. The stack effect can be enhanced by adding more to the side to make the ventilation keep moving. But the most important factor in getting the stack effect to work is by increasing the height as much as possible. Getting this height differential causes there to be more difference between the low pressure and high pressure, and then ends up pulling the air through. So the larger the height, the better. So if we start looking at some of the halls that were being designed in the 1831. This is the hall for Vienna. That was their first music hall before the Musikvereins Hall. You can see on the sides here that the windows are being used for the stack effect. And we move to their next facility, which was built in 1870, and we see much the same thing. That original hall was about 700 seats. This hall is 1,774 seats, and you can see it's much the same plan, but the windows are higher in the room to get more circulation, more people. When you consider the Odeon and Musikvereins Hall side by side, one space built in 15 BC, the other space built in 1870, you can see there are quite a few similarities, the Musikvereins just being a larger room in length to accommodate more people. And so that continued for quite some time, all of the major concert halls in Europe being built with similar characteristics. The Berlin Concert House, which opened in 1821, that one seats about 1,400 and is 68 feet wide with windows high on the sidewalls. The Musikvereins in 1870 is about 63 feet wide with windows high on the sidewalls. There's going to be a theme here. The Concertgebouw, which was built in 1888, is the largest at 92 feet wide, but also has windows high on the sidewalls. And then, of course, Boston Symphony, which was built in 1900, and that's the largest of them all at 2,600. But again, the same pattern. It's 75 feet wide and has windows high on the sidewalls. So those were the factors that were shaping the building form. The music was being shaped because of the spaces that they were played in. So symphonic pieces were being written for these long, narrow, tall rooms. And instrument construction of the time was also being modified because of the rooms that they were playing into. So the violin, for example, in the 16th through the 19th century was going through a series of changings to adapt to that space. The necks, the fingerboards were made longer and they were tilted. The necks were lengthened, the bass bars were made heavier, all of this to allow for greater tension so that they could get higher notes and they could get more volume out of the instruments, and other instruments followed similar suit. In addition to the instruments changing, the musicians were also changing their techniques for the forms that they were playing into. So how did we move from the Opera House at Versailles in 1770 to the Musikverein in the 1870s, and then make that jump to things like the Auditorium Theater, which was built in 1889, or even something like Frank Lloyd Wright's Humphreys Theater, which was built in 1959. In the 19th century, we started to have newer alloys of iron that allowed us to build at greater spans. They were stronger and lighter, which opened up the opportunities to change the profile or building form. The rooms got wider to increase the amount of audience they could bring into the space, and they also got larger and deeper balconies so that they could bring the audience closer to the performing area, which meant these rooms could just grow exponentially. The modern ventilation systems also meant that the rooms could change quite a bit, in that they no longer needed windows in them to be able to let in ventilation or to let in light, which means that they could keep out the sounds of the industrial age with isolation techniques, not using windows, but it also meant that they could lower the volumes in the room, which you see in the Frank Lloyd Wright building there, because they didn't need to make that stack effect work. So during the same time that we saw the advances in structure capacity and in the building systems, the theater was also undergoing a social and economic change, just as it had done in the 17th century in Europe, when it moved from the salons of the nobility to that first paying theater that we talked about earlier. The performing arts in the U.S. are not funded by by the government as they are in Europe. So the orchestras, operas, theater companies all get funding. Here, the only subsidies we get are in the form of philanthropy subsidies on their taxes, or perhaps tax breaks for building a new facility. So the operas, the theaters, the orchestras all have to self-sustain or support themselves through ticket sales. In larger cities, this is less difficult when you have a larger pile of philanthropists to pull from, right? So we have more money that can be donated and support a single structure room for a concert hall or for the opera house. But in middle-sized cities and in smaller cities, if people want to have access to an orchestra, or an orchestra would like to exist, they have to pool together with the operas and the theater companies. So when a theater must accommodate an orchestra, opera, a ballet, a Broadway, popular music, and spoken word, it's really the symphonic component that puts the most stress or pressure on the theater form. The stage layouts and the audience chamber have the most pressure from the acoustic needs, where ballet and opera have many similarities in what they need for the acoustic response from the room or the stage, and where amplified productions can be presented in those spaces with only slight modifications to the absorption around the room to make sure that we're cleaning up some of the spill that can come under the walls. It's really the symphonic components that push the requirements for this space the most. The classical music repertoire, as we just went through, was designed and developed in the classic shoebox-shaped halls of the orchestras of Europe. But when we moved into the rooms that were larger and wider, we had a lack of early reflections. We had a ratio of lower volume to more absorption than what had been in the shoebox halls. And there was a fair amount of diffusion in the shoebox halls that wasn't present in the modern theater. So with the shaping of the audience chambers fanning out, all of those issues had to be addressed. But really the main difference that started to shape the form of the theater was what was happening on the stage for the musicians. The conditions on the stage in a multipurpose theater bore little resemblance to what was happening in the shoebox halls, and there were no surfaces around the orchestra, and their sound was lost into the stage house. The cross ensemble hearing was incredibly difficult with no surfaces to support them. And to the audience, when the orchestras were playing in these types of theaters, it sounded as though they were playing in a different room, because really they were playing in a different room. So to try and solve this problem, painted canvas flats were brought in to give an enclosure to the orchestra. Now, these painted flats actually did provide some useful reflections in the high frequencies that sent some of their sound energy out into the audience, and so it was a step in the right direction. But they didn't have ceilings, so a lot of the orchestra's energy was still lost, and the ensemble hearing was not enhanced. This is a picture, by the way, of the Chicago Orchestra playing in the Auditorium Theater with a painted flat. Next, there was a move to make some more heavy, massive shells to try and deal with the loss of sound into the stage house. And these shells were also a step in the right direction because they helped project the sound out into the audience, but they were incredibly, overwhelmingly loud on stage for the musicians. And they were massive and heavy, which made them difficult to move and get into place and keep the houses rotating quickly through the performance types that they had to support. They also took up a large amount of space on stage, which was critical in a multi-purpose venue. So the next iteration was a more lightweight fiberglass reinforced polyester and aluminum shell that was started to be constructed in the 1960s, but that was the forerunner of what we use today, the modern honeycomb and aluminum shell that takes up quite a bit less space. And it is more lightweight, but it has struck a good balance between the amount of mid-frequency energy that we need on stage with a material that is stiff and reflects the sound, but is also lightweight. So, of course, there's so much more that we could talk about in the shaping of the auditorium theater, but this was just supposed to be like a brief overview of what happened to cause the shaping of the multi-purpose form today. The piece of information that I'd like us all to walk away with here is that spaces have always been multi-use. They will always continue to be multi-use, and as good stewards of the acoustics, we should keep that in mind as we enter into every single venue that we design. And then lastly, we should always, always keep in mind that every space that we design will always be used for banquets. Thank you.
Yeah, so we do have some time for questions, if there are any. Sure.
Yes.
So is there a distinction in time where owners or, nobility or whoever had a hall built for a purpose and just said, well, I'm just going to do whatever I want with it, versus what seems to be more modern, which is you must make my hall that I'm spending a lot of money on do lots of things?
No, there really wasn't. I mean, all of the opera houses that were built or theater spaces, the intent was always just to do performance in them. And the performing art of the time was really a result of what was happening socially in society at the time. And so even though all of these spaces that we called opera houses were called opera houses, that was really the form of performance that was going on, but they were always used for multiple things. So, the example that we gave of the, I'm going to pull back up to, all the way at the beginning, I apologize. So the Opera House at Versailles, even though this was called an opera house and it was deemed and built as an opera house, really the intention when it was originally built was that it was going to be used for all things, hosting weddings, for gathering the assembly, for the French government, all of that. It's always been thought that these were just spaces that you could do a performance in. It wasn't until we had public theaters that they started to build spaces specifically for music. And the example at Oxford being the first, but then Vienna really being one of the forerunners in those first two rooms we showed.
Okay, we are out of time for questions. Thanks, Robin. Okay, our next paper is by Steve Ellison from Meyer Sounds Labs. It's Active Acoustics in Multipurpose Venues, a 10-year retrospective.